Hi, I'm Max Bergman, Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program in the Stewart Center at the Center for Strategic International Studies, and you're listening to The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Hello and welcome back to the Eurofile. Before we dive into today's episode, a quick reminder, our team is thinking about the next chapter of the Eurofile podcast. We want to hear from you about what works, what doesn't, what changes you'd like to see in the future. So please send us your thoughts and feedback by emailing erep@csis.org. That's erep@csis.org. And you can find us on social media and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. So we really just want to get your feedback on how we can make the show better. So now on to today's show, I'm thrilled to welcome back our guest, Sander Tordoir. Sander is Chief Economist at the Center for European Reform, but he's also a non-resident senior associate with us here at CSIS in the Europe, Russia, Eurasia Program. He's an expert on Eurozone monetary and fiscal policy with experience in institutions including the European Central Bank, the German Federal Finance Ministry, and the World Bank. His policy research is widely cited in outlets including Foreign Policy, The Economist, and the Financial Times. Sander is here because he is the recent co-author with Brad Setzer of a really remarkable report that is causing real waves in Berlin, but also throughout Europe, about the China shock for Germany and for the European economy. The paper is called China Shock 2.0, The Cost of Germany's Complacency, which is particularly interesting in the context of recent news reports that Beijing is ramping up its exports to Europe. Sander, thanks so much for joining us on the Eurofile.
Thanks for having me back.
So maybe could you just give us sort of the bottom line of your report? Why did you write this report? What was its conclusion? And is Europe really facing a real crisis to its current economic model?
I think the reason to write the report, it's not as though my co-author Brad and I had not written or covered these topics before. What we were seeing in both the trade data and Chinese and German macroeconomic data indicates a clear acceleration of China's export glut globally and a surge in European imports from China that are at a pace and scale which is hard to explain with what some of the more euphemistic takes around this debate would suggest is just a simple matter of China getting better at, say, cars or machines or chemicals. It is very self-evident, in my view, that we're dealing here with a far more aggressive set of industrial policy from China, but also a set of macroeconomic distortions and problems that China is unable and unwilling to move out of, and that a lot of the costs that that's creating are getting essentially offloaded onto especially Germany, but the entire European Union. I mean, just to give you one staggering, I think, statistic, is that it's extremely hard to find a single European country with growing exports to China. The one exception is the Netherlands because it sells semiconductor machines. But mostly across the EU, countries are seeing exploding Chinese imports and declining exports to China. So where trade tends to be, in aggregate, a two-way street, it doesn't always have to balance, unlike what President Trump thinks. But with big economies, big economic blocs, you expect to see a form of comparative advantage where one country provides cars or machines and the other country provide electronics or any other setup. That's decisively no longer the case with China. The threat here is that Germany is really at risk of facing a dramatic decline in the sectors that have long been iconic and central for German prosperity, productivity, and also in a world of geopolitical strife, its ability to produce armaments and to provide economic security for its people.
Is this a deliberate strategy by China to undercut the European car market? I mean, and there's been a lot of allegations, I think quite proven, that China is really subsidizing its car industry. I mean, I guess the way I sort of think about it as sort of a non-economist is a little bit like the DC cab sector. Uber and Lyft came into the market about a decade ago. They completely undercut the cab industry. The cab industry was quite outdated, and the cars were crappy, and Uber and Lyft were this great new product, and it was much cheaper than actually taking a taxi. They destroyed the DC taxi industry. So now if you come to DC, you can't really hail a taxi. So you're stuck with Uber and Lyft, and the prices are like 3 times as what they used to be. That kind of strategy of sort of flooding the market, taking out the German car sector, raising prices eventually to get to sort of more profitability? Or is this just sort of China investing, saying we want a car industry? The car industry is really cutthroat. They're producing good stuff. How would you kind of characterize this?
I think your metaphor is pretty good. So if you think of China as a venture capital state on steroids, essentially, since its Made in China 2025 strategy launched 10 years ago, provinces around the country have been doubling down on automotive production and innovation, as you say. The cars are good. They are iPhones on wheels. They've captured a lot of the global battery supply chain, which in many ways is the car's engine. So there's no question that it's partly quality. But the level of subsidies and the level of overcapacity that this push has generated is leading to rock bottom prices and price pressures and margin pressures in China. It is exceptionally difficult even for Chinese car makers to make money in China, and a profound pressure on any firm that produces cars in China, including foreign firms, to go for exports, because that's where you can still make a buck, a euro, a dollar, or a renminbi. And so that's really what's driving this. So if you are in your Uber, Lyft world, you're kind of in the early or mid stages of this, where they're rapidly capturing market share. I think where China has historically struggled is to go into the phase of monopolist pricing, even in solar panels, where China is the global monopolist, more or less. And it's still, the country is struggling with overcapacity, which is arguably a gift for those worried about climate change. But I think it shows that the excesses of Chinese industrial policy and macro industrial policy in the form of an undervalued currency and a consumption level that is too low for its own good are hard to reverse. It's very difficult for China to close a whole bunch of, let's say, solar panel manufacturing plants across the country because capacity is too high, profits are too low. There are lots of domestic tensions and troubles that the governing party in China is certainly worried about. Reversing that's very difficult. The same in steel, classic good old steel. China's production capacity is 50-60% of global demand. China does not fulfill 60% of global demand, in part because steel is one of those sectors that quickly gets shut down behind tariffs by trading partners like the US and even the EU. But it's proven very difficult for China to reverse some of the overcapacities in steel, because overall market that an Uber or Lyft would be operating in would be one of healthy demand. And in China, that demand is lacking. And so at some point, the rubber hits the road and it's just very difficult to continue. But the distortions are real and costly, and the subsidies have to keep rolling in some ways. So this is the trap also for China itself, which all of this has really been exacerbated by a real estate bust, which is massive and unresolved in some ways, and is really a big drag on Chinese domestic demand, because households are struggling with declining house prices, with mortgages that exceed the value of their housing, not unlike housing busts we've seen in other countries. So it's quite a complex picture, where Uber Lyft's success story goes some way in explaining what's happening here, but the end stage of this game is much less clear to me.
Thank you for being kind to my analogy. Maybe we could get into the politics of this a little bit, because this is not a new problem. I think you and Brad wrote a similar paper a year or a few years ago. This was a concern of the Scholz government. But it strikes me that one of the challenges here has been the German car sector itself, with companies like Volkswagen, Mercedes, selling so many cars to China, in some ways becoming quasi-Chinese companies in terms of, where their production is based. And so is there a political shift happening in Germany, or where's the German car sector? Maybe you could talk a little bit about, because it does feel that your paper has sort of awoken a much greater concern. I mean, Germany's economy has been stagnant for 5-6 years. Is there now sort of clear momentum inside of Berlin to push for action?
I think what has changed versus this debate in the past few years is a few variables that have switched the dial. One is that Germany's export business to China, which at its peak reached almost 3% of German GDP, is in steep decline, if not collapse. German exports to China are really dropping off a cliff. That includes very prominently car exports to China, which have dropped by more than 50%, but also holds for aircraft exports from Germany to China, down 50%. Machine exports from Germany to China down substantially. In fact, Germany is now a net importer of Chinese machines, which invariably means more German hospitals, factories, and buildings will be equipped with Chinese, not German machinery. So that is a big change that's really accelerated in the last 6-7 quarters, 2 years. Another big change is Germany is now rapidly losing manufacturing jobs, between 10 and 15,000 jobs a month. The EW Cologne, a German research institute, estimates that the second China shock, which by the way refers specifically to China's exploding trade surpluses over the last 5 years, there is a technical definition here. In that period, Germany has lost, according to their estimate, 400,000 jobs because of this. That's a big shock. That's almost 10% of Germany's manufacturing workforce. So, take those two things together. And a third factor, which is China's deployment quite aggressively of rare earth export controls. In fact, just yesterday, China put 14 European countries on its sanctions list in response to a new batch of EU-Russia sanctions, which partly involve China because China is providing economic support for Russia's war. Includes Germany's most important defense company, Rheinmetall, which is now, in principle, no longer eligible to receive rare earth inputs from China. So those three factors, job losses, a collapsing China business for Germany, and growing concerns about economic security are the backdrop, I think, in which our report showing that there are very strong macroeconomic drivers and very strong microeconomic industrial policy drivers behind all those trends. And that if anything, they're accelerating and worsening. I think really focused minds in Berlin and the German debate. And I should give some credit to our friends in Paris, because the French G7 presidency, I sometimes call it the G6 because the US is a very hesitant member of that club. But the French G7 presidency has been squarely focused on global imbalances, which is macroeconomic jargon for a China that underconsumes and overexports and a US that probably overconsumes. There's a bigger global debate. But I think that's also really pushed the European Union, I think, towards a set of hard questions. None of this means that Germany knows what it's supposed to do now. I think the French have some views. We certainly had a number of proposals in the report, a kind of plan de campagne, an approach plan for Germany with its European partners to fight back. But whether that is the direction of travel, I think is still very much subject to discussion across the continent.
So let's, I think, shift gears. That's a good segue to what should Europe do here? Because this isn't just Berlin's decision. Berlin, I think, is the key actor in many respects. But what I hear from the EU and also German officials across Europe is that the fear is that China has escalation dominance, right? You mentioned rare earths. And so if the EU does anything, then China will just come down like a ton of bricks. And that will, be potentially devastating to the European economy. So how do you think Europe should respond here?
If I can put it a little starkly, I think European leaders and politicians, and maybe the economists that I argue with a lot, we need to think about three questions. One is Europe willing to bear the adjustment cost of China's broken real estate sector? And is it willing to accept that China is growing, getting 1 to 2 percentage points of GDP growth a year out of net exports, when the German economy and the European economy are largely stagnant, notwithstanding some pockets of strength? There's a real economic headwind, a massive drag on German and European growth, which is a result of Chinese policy choice. Can Europe live with a admittedly very weird global future equilibrium where China produces most of the world's cars and a lot of its machines and most of its chemicals? And is Europe willing to accept that China can impose dependence, ever more dependence on the basis of ongoing dependence? And that last question is the most nasty one, and you flagged it. Europe is already, like most of the world, like the US, dependent on Chinese rare earths. There is an open flank that China has never deployed because it's so dark but also most of the world is very much reliant on active pharmaceutical ingredients for all sorts of basic medication, like painkillers or antibiotics. Obviously, China has never weaponized that because it quite literally means that people will perish. But there are a couple of real gaping economic security holes. So how do you deal with that? I think Europe has more strengths than it's willing to admit. A China that is growing strongly off the back of exports with a very weak domestic economy clearly needs the European market. And so that gives you leverage if European leaders are also willing to show and bare their teeth and say, this market access is not granted and given for free. If you are pursuing policies which are too costly for us, then we will respond and the cost will come your way too. And I think the other big issue is whether a union of 27 member states is willing to engage in a degree of supply chain warfare with China. And by that, I mean, not that that's the goal, but the goal should be to rebalance the trading relationship, including through a number of tariffs or import restrictions on China's production glut, buttressed by a threat that if China responds by escalating, not symmetrically by putting some tariffs on European products, which matters less as Europe's export business to China goes down, by the way. So there's a symmetry here that's in Europe's advantage. But to say if you then resort to a complete cutoff of rare earth minerals, Europe will be forced to cut off China from semiconductor machinery, aircraft engines, very specialized turbines, and other pieces of high-end kit that China still needs Europe for. That needs to be, unfortunately, on the table for the scenario in which China responds with, essentially to a normal, albeit very large trade dispute with an active escalation. And I think that is the big challenge because obviously these levers that Europe can play, including semiconductor machinery, they're not so much European as they are, in this case, a Dutch national decision. And the same for aircraft engines, that would be a Franco-German decision. And so the risk is that China plays divide and conquer.
So I want to maybe get into the weeds a little bit on how Europe should respond, or on the mechanism, I guess. So there's a lot of talk of the anti-coercion instrument. This is a tool that EU developed a number of years ago, has never invoked it. It basically, the way I interpret it, is it enables the Commission to go to the mattresses, to go to war. It basically is like the Council has gotten together and is sort of, we authorize you to go to war. It doesn't tell the Commission what it exactly needs to do. It makes Ursula von der Leyen the general in this war. I mean, that's an oversimplification. Is that what should happen here? Because it strikes me very hard to just do tariffs and then have China retaliate, and then the Commission not really being empowered to then take action. And that China, I think, because China can weaponize the division within the European Council, Spain being very close now to China, getting a lot of investment. So I'm curious, just what's the mechanism here? Are you saying, hit the bazooka, hit the anti-coercion instrument, or do new tools need to be created? Doesn't that take time? So what's the mechanism here?
So I think I would think of this as an escalation playbook, the way that sanctions theory, for example, works. Europe, in the EU, trade competence is a European competence, logically, because it's one market. So I think the EU needs to put in place a number of trade defense measures. Those could include, which has been proposed in the G7 context and an idea that Brad and I further elaborate on, so-called safeguard measures. So these are not the product by product anti-dumping, anti-subsidy cases that the EU is currently pursuing against China, where they put tariffs on truck tires, but not on electric trucks. They've put tariffs on electric vehicles, but the EU forgot about hybrids. And lo and behold, Chinese hybrid exports are up 14 times over the last two or 3 years. It's not working because you're dealing with a macro shock and you're shooting at this with the P gun. So one option would be to deploy safeguard measures, which are faster to bring online, take a couple of months. You don't have to show the whole universe of China's subsidy distortions. And in theory, in an older GATT pre-WTO world, there was real discussion of countries should be allowed to use these safeguards, where you just say, I see an import surge and I see declining prices, I'm going to react. So you identify the symptom and you put on a trade defense measure, much more quick, a little more dirty, but it's more effective. And you could, in principle, do that for whole product groups, all cars, not just EVs, all machines or a family of machines, which the German Machine Building Association has suggested. So a little bit broader, a little bit more assertive, a little quicker to get into a more fruitful negotiation with China. and have a credible threat of a degree of market closure, or at least level playing field measures. But you're right that you need to be prepared for whatever reaction comes from Beijing and to game that out. And so I think step 2 and 3 would have to be an agreement at the European Council to use whatever revenues those tariffs generate to create a compensation fund for whoever gets targeted by Chinese retaliation. In the US, that often ended up being the farmers, who then got some help from DC. In the European case, it may be French luxury companies, maybe a number of Polish companies, who knows? But you need to have a fund in place to flexibly basically ensure cohesion. And then the third step would have to be thinking through which supply chain export control measures Europe would levy on China if it were to come to that. I don't even know if that's the case. Nobody knows. This has never been tried before by the Europeans. Maybe China responds symmetrically and says we're going to put tariffs on Hermes luxury bags from Paris, which would probably be less of a major shock than a rare earth cutoff. But these kinds of scenarios, the European Commission will have to think through, and it's a little bit outside the comfort zone, I think, of EU policy machinery, which has long been built around a rules-based global order, which the US built together with Europe and Japan, and which now is more about power and the exercise of power to also still defend your economic interests. It's much more discretionary and negotiating type logic than sitting in a WTO subcommittee in Geneva and haggling over a chicken standard.
I'm not sure a bailout fund for Hermes bags. I could see that launching a populist outrage.
It can be weirdly mundane. I mean,
yes.
You would be surprised how many trade deals have been scuppered by the big chicken lobby, which is on an absurdness level equivalent to fighting over luxury handbags, which, by the way, are very expensive and create quite a lot of economic value for France and Italy.
They seem quite nice. I don't have one, but it does strike me here that one of the things that what you're bringing to attention is sort of a structural problem within the European Union in general, that when there's been this illusion that economic policy is in its sort of own neat little silo, and then you have sort of defense and foreign policy over here, just the domains of the member states. But if there's going to be this sort of trade war or trade back and forth this with China, that very much is a political exercise. And it strikes me that the economists over here aren't generals, and the generals over here in the foreign policy hands, they're not playing in this space. And so I think that strikes me as one of the structural challenges. Another challenge that I hear to bring Washington into this is the instability in transatlantic relations. The fact is that I think Europeans are sort of concerned that if they throw a punch toward China, they're not sure if Washington's going to come and hit them on the back of the head as well. And so the instability in US-Europe relations, is that playing a role here? Because it strikes me in some ways, this is exactly what we've wanted Europeans to do, to take a stronger line to China, to stand up to China economically. Europe is about to do that. And then we're now threatening all sorts of things vis-a-vis Europe. It looks like the Turnberry deal is constantly on the ropes. There was just a fine against Google for roughly $1 billion, which then is causing, Jameson Greer, our USTR, to react to. So, I mean, the lack of transatlantic alignment, well, what is your take? Is that sort of preventing Europe from acting here? How are Europeans thinking about that?
I think the interplay is important. Part of the reason that Europe is under particular pressure from China is because there's also trouble on the transatlantic trade front, which is far more important for both Europe and the US, by the way, than the relationship with China, purely in trade and investment terms. Multitudes bigger and more important. So there is a kind of double whammy economic problem. So the China shock's far bigger than the shock from US tariffs, but a world in which European car and machine builders are struggling in China and then get whacked at the same time in the US is extra painful. There's also a real political problem where France and Germany are increasingly coalescing around a set of measures and negotiations with China, which will be tough. Whereas the Trump administration is very much in a Busan, South Korea truce mindset with China, with occasional flare-ups, admittedly, also between the US and China over AI policy, chip export controls. But broadly, the US is not very keen to rock the boat with China. So Europe is, in a way, doing this alone. And that is just a fact of where the transatlantic relationship is. not completely alone. I think Japan is, as we speak, under widespread export control measures by China. There are concerns in Turkey, Brazil, even the UK to an extent about what China's export glut and increasing dominance of a whole host of industrial supply chains actually means for them. So there is what we called in the paper, a potential for industrial and trade policy tinder in the Mark Carney sense, where you build a coalition of third and middle powers who align a set of policies to shield some of their most important industries from China. That probably has to be the direction of travel. And then who knows where a future US will be. Incidentally, which is funny, you mentioned the anti-coercion instrument, which Europe built as a response to Chinese coercion on Lithuania over their relationship with Taiwan. And then the anti-coercion instrument was almost deployed against the US. I think we should have, but it wasn't done over some of the tariff threats and so on from Trump. I think it would be similarly possible and also a bit ironic that if Europe builds a new trade tool to deal with macroeconomic distortions like the one from China, that Europe may end up deploying that at some point against the Trump administration. I don't know. But Europe right now does not have a US Section 301 or 232 legal basis to pursue more flexibly a set of trade defense measures against a trading partner that has, for example, an undervalued currency.
But just quickly on that, I mean, so do you think new tools should be created? Because that will take time. Or is the bazooka just worth employing? And then, because my understanding, one of the problems with the anti-coercion instrument is not the instrument itself. It's just that member states then lose control of what the commission would do, and member states don't want to lose control, and they want to box in the commission. So we're sort of back in the kind of structural issues of the EU, Brussels versus member states. Do you think that the direction of travel here is that the member states will never do ACI, so time to develop a section, the equivalence here for Europe?
So I think there are two levels of argument. One is a new tool will take a lot of time. It has to be legislated. It has to go through Parliament, Council, Commission. So I don't think it's the obvious short-run measure to take. For that, the discussion on safeguards is far more relevant. There is a push to force European companies to diversify inputs from suppliers to avoid them becoming too reliant on China, which could be a bureaucratic nightmare, but it's understandable thinking. And then there's an ongoing legislation in Brussels called the Industrial Accelerator Act, which introduces a number of buy-European clauses in a set of industries, a bit like the US's Inflation Reduction Act from a few years ago. So some things are happening. The new tool, if that becomes the answer, then you might end up with 2 years of designing a new tool, lots of debate, lots of tensions over how much power does the commission get? Do we do qualified majority voting, yes or no? And very little action when there is overwhelming evidence that the China shock is hurting European and German industry. And so that I think would be a mistake. A second argument here is that there is a gap in the toolbox precisely for the reason you mentioned on the institutional front, that between product-specific cases on truck tires or specific chemicals and the bazooka, there isn't much in between, where Europe has a tool to respond to a specific trading partner with a specific, for example, undervalued currency, which is harming Europe's interests. So I do think conceptually, the problem with China has revealed a gap in the toolkit that in the long run, I think Europe should plug. And the US's toolbox, which has many different elements and Trump uses and abuses all of them, does provide some clues into what Europe could do. So in an ideal world, you do both. You put on a number of these measures, and then at the same time, Europe builds a more flexible tool that is also easier to trigger than the anti-coercion instrument because it has a bit more of a constrained, circumscribed mandate and focus. Namely, you can deploy this tool against a specific trading partner, i.e. China, or maybe potentially the US in the future, which is pursuing a set of macro policies which are hurting you. Member states may be a little bit more relaxed about giving the Commission that mandate versus the anti-coercion instrument, which in terms of measures, the Commission, as you said, sort of going to war, the general can then do all sorts of things, which member states obviously find a bit nerve-wracking. So that's how I would think to the institutional question.
Do you think Europe is underestimating its resilience to, let's just say China went full out against Europe? Because, when I think back to 2022 and the energy crisis, Europe was very hesitant initially to sanction Russian gas because spring of 2022, there was a lot of studies from German industry of like it would cause a Great Depression in Germany. Now, the explosion of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 was not good for the German economy, not good for the Europe's economy. It caused a huge energy crisis. Yet support for Ukraine remained, Europe survived. And so do you think, short, sharp shock, or maybe it's not so short, would actually make Europe stronger in the longer run? That actually, if China went too far, then Europe figures out rare earths. There's a huge effort to sort of reduce that dependency. How do you think about that? Does that sort of worry you that the worst case scenario here, does it have a silver lining and a potential bright side that it would actually, in 5 years, Europe would be much more economically resilient and stronger? So how do you think about that?
Possible. I mean, I agree with your reading of the 2022-3 energy shock. It was bad. It was painful. It stymied Europe's recovery from the pandemic shock in some ways. But at the same time, it wasn't the beginning of the next Great Depression. So I think there is a case to be made that sometimes you need an acute shock to have a change in policy. The only quibble there is that with gas and oil, there were alternative sources of supply called the US, by the way, for Europe, which with rare earths is more tricky because China has a global monopoly and the US itself struggling to secure enough China-free rare earth supply, which, by the way, the US has known for 15 years that its rare earth dependency on China was a problem. Even under the Biden administration, when economic security really came to the foreground as a key priority, not much was done to fix that dependence. And it took Trump waging a misguided trade war against the whole world, but particularly against China, which in some ways he really had to back down because of China's rare earth weapon, well telegraphed in advance. Took all of that to happen for the US to really put the full force of the US government behind reducing that dependency. So I think you're generally right that crises can create these kinds of long-term resilience. The jury is still out, by the way, if that's going to work. And it's the only area in which the US shows real interest in working with G7 plus partners. But I think the impetus is very obvious for all to see. I do think generally Europe has more resilience than it gives itself credit for. A China that needs badly the European market to grow is a China that also is not unafraid of Europe seriously threatening to close some of its market or at least limit market access. And if Chinese diplomats were paying more proper attention, I think, to what Europe is signaling, it's not that they want to decouple. It's also not that the EU does not want trade or investment with China. Probably it wants more of that than the US would want in an ideal world, but that the current trajectory is unacceptable and unsustainable. But the unfortunate dynamic I see thus far is that China is very much in a mood to punch back and to, in some ways, almost gaslight the Europe's concerns that they're not seeing things straight. That makes it very difficult to have that discussion. I think it underscores the need for Merz and Macron and the Commission. As long as those are simming from the same heimsheet, I think Europe can make a credible set of threats, but also offer a credible set of carrots to China. But that is the key and crux for France and Germany to stick together. Spain is, as you say, on a more accommodative trajectory. But even in Spain, there are concerns about China's plants being built in Spain using mostly Chinese workers, mostly Chinese inputs. So I'm not sure the Spanish position is not going to align a little bit more with the growing European consensus over time.
Yeah, I think my sense is that Beijing, I think, has a very similar conception of Europe as Washington does. And I think Scott Bessent at Davos sort of put it well. When he said something to the effect of, what's Europe going to do? Convene another meeting or a white paper or something very dismissive. And I think the sense is in China and here in the US that if you just shout loudly enough and if you tap certain member states on the shoulder, you can divide and rule. Europe will back down. Europe is weak and feckless. And so, part of this that I think is quite interesting is just Europe is now sort of gearing up. Everyone's picking on Europe. I think if Europe punch someone, then the other side sort of starts paying attention. Most wars don't end up in nuclear obliteration. That's why we're all still alive. So there's always a way to, I think, modulate this. But maybe just a final question. We're in the dead of summer. Europe, all you lazy Europeans are about to take your 2 months of vacation. And when Europe sort of comes back in September, do you think this is going to be front of the agenda? Where do you think this is headed? Do you see action happening? Is the fall going to be dominated by, a massive trade fight between Brussels and Beijing? Do you think this is headed for a confrontation?
If I were a betting man, that would not be my main bet. I think there is a higher probability that Europe will get intimidated, which I think, based on your comment just now, we both would consider a mistake, because occasionally throwing a punch does not mean you end up in nuclear war in economic terms. You can always calibrate the response, but it is important at some point to throw a punch to show that you can fight for your interests, and that gets you into a much better negotiation with China in this case. I think the crux will be the following. President Macron and Bundeskanzler Merz have clearly said a wildly undervalued Chinese currency is unacceptable. They've also clearly stressed all the other distortions, the subsidies, etc., that China has bringing to the global economy and the European economy. And Commissioner Šefčovič, in charge with trade, has said that by October, he wants to see progress in their negotiations with China. So my sense is that that's the do or die moment for Europe. If China does not deliver a set of meaningful concessions, and by that I mean a real commitment to revalue the currency, a real commitment with stringent voluntary export restrictions on cars, machines, and a bunch of other sectors, all of which is painful for China in the short run, then I think Europe needs to move and act and take a number of measures in its own interest. And that will be the test. And my fear is that European leaders will say, well, let's maybe negotiate for a few more months. Let's maybe kick the can again, which would be a mistake. It could be a couple months, but ultimately the EU would lose credibility. So that's, in a sense, how I'm thinking through the scenarios. And the key person to watch is the Chancellor, whether he goes from very clearly, very clear-eyed description of the issue and bravely just tabling it, goes in a couple of months from, okay, look, I've put a few asks on the table to Beijing. They're not responding. That means I'm going to instruct Brussels together with President Macron and other leaders to take action. And the other thing I would watch, so you probably end up in between world where Europe takes some measures, but it doesn't amount to all that much. But a few measures that would be meaningful would be an extension of the EV tariffs to hybrid cars, would be a number of safeguard trade defense measures on broad subsectors or whole sectors. I think those, in a way, the three things to watch. The October deadline, what does Chancellor Merz say going into that deadline? Is the Commission going to actually table in September, October, a package of measures that looks serious?
Well, Sander, we're going to have you back to see if you're right, and we'll be following this closely. Thanks so much for joining us on the Eurofile today.
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.